Welcome, my viewer. I haven't made content or videos for a little while. If you know me, you know that I just had a daughter, and Charlotte Isabel, a few days ago, about 10 days ago now. So this is my first video in a while, and also it's just because it's like kind of the end of the spring term of teaching. Fall term starts in a few weeks, so this was kind of my in-between time. But I want to jump back into it, and I got a good one for today. So, grab a coffee or a tea or something, and let's get into this. This is a video called Mass Psychosis, and it's by a collaboration between After School, who I love, and who, if you've watched this channel at all, know that I support big time. Their animations are incredible, and apparently the script was done by the Academy of Ideas. So I haven't actually seen this one. Usually I present on my channel like stuff that I like and I want to share. But, I like both these channels, and they've collaborated on a topic that's couldn't be more essentially important. So let's watch this together. Cheers. Hope you're doing well. Enough of an introduction. Let's start the video.
This after-school presentation was written and narrated by Academy of Ideas. Check out their YouTube channel for more of their videos.
Oh, I can already tell this can be good. Oh, what's that whistle music?
The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduced them. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. According to the psychologist Carl Jung, the greatest threat to civilization lies not with the forces of nature, nor with any physical disease, but with our inability to deal with the forces of our own psyche. We are our own worst enemies, or as the Latin proverb puts it, man is a wolf to man. In Civilization in Transition, Jung states that this proverb is a sad yet eternal truism, and our wolf-like tendencies come most prominently into play at those times of history when mental illness becomes the norm rather than the exception in a society, a situation which Jung termed a psychic epidemic. Indeed, it is becoming ever more obvious, he writes, that it is not famine, not earthquakes, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself, who is man's greatest danger to man, for the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes. In this video, we are going to explore the most dangerous of all psychic
And obviously, like a word, I almost don't even need to make this comparison, right? Like, obviously, the word epidemic has a whole new meaning to everybody than it did even a few years ago. Well, it means the same thing, but a different level of felt experience. And the idea that that could also be existing at a collective unconscious level is an interesting thought. Incredible interesting thought. And this Carl Jung, the symbolic life, or man and his symbols, looks like the symbolic life.
Epidemics, the mass psychosis. A mass psychosis is an epidemic of madness, and it occurs when a large portion of a society loses touch with reality and descends into delusion.
And remember, like, his use of words like mental illness and madness, and those would be the two that I've heard so far. They need to be contextualized time period wise, that those were actually the correct, or the words that people were using. I know that it sounds different, but it's not famine, nor earthquakes, nor microbes, nor cancer, but man himself, who is the greatest danger to man, for the simple reason that there's no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst natural catastrophes. Carl Jung.
Such a phenomenon is not a thing of fiction. Two examples of mass psychoses are the American and European witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, and the rise of totalitarianism in the 20th century.
I should do one
During
on the witch hunts.
Thousands of individuals, mostly women, were killed, not for any crimes they committed, but because they became the scapegoats of societies gone mad. In some Swiss villages, right?
Interesting ideas too about how there may have been molding of the bread in that area. I think ergot's the thing that it's called. They might have been tripping out during the Salem witch trials. What I need to do a video on the Salem. I've been to Salem, but Salem, Massachusetts, when I was a kid. But that would be an awesome video. I'll have to make a note of that.
Francis Hill, there were scarcely any women left alive after the frenzy had finally burned itself out. When a mass psychosis occurs, the results are devastating. Jung studied this phenomenon and wrote that the individuals who make up the infected society become morally and spiritually inferior. They sink unconsciously to an inferior intellectual level. They become more unreasonable, irresponsible, emotional, erratic, and unreliable. And worst of all, crimes the individual alone could never stand are freely committed by the group smitten by madness. What makes matters worse is that those suffering from a mass psychosis are unaware of what is occurring. For just as an individual gone mad cannot step out of his mind to observe the errors in his ways,
What imagery?
so too there is no Archimedean point from which those living through a mass psychosis can observe their collective madness.
Okay, so that's an amazing word, an Archimedean point. Like, there's no idea that's so central to your philosophy and lived code that it actually is what stabilizes it. It's the foundational idea. He's saying like that's when that's absent. Well, when that's absent, it's a major issue.
But what causes a mass psychosis? To answer this question, we must first explore what drives an individual mad. While there are many potential triggers of madness, such as an excessive use of drugs or alcohol, brain injuries, and other illnesses, these physical causes will not concern us here. Our concern is with psychological, or what are called psychogenic triggers, as these are the most common culprits of the mass psychosis. The most prevalent psychogenic cause of a psychosis is a flood of negative emotions, such as fear or anxiety, that drives an individual into...
Yeah, because remember, so it seems like when they're using words like madness and stuff, like I said earlier, they're continuing with Jung's, the way he framed it in that quote. And in early psychology, there was this idea of like there's kind of a branch that's considered psychosis, and that's like delusional, what we would now think of as like schizophrenia, anything that's like about kind of a break of reality, and then what's called neurosis, right? And that's what we would now consider like anything related to anxiety, things related to OCD, panic, PTSD, all those things would, anything that's at the, yeah. So that's if you look at like the early kind of trees definitionally of what psychology was. Neurosis and psychosis were the words that people like Jung and Freud would have known.
A state of panic. When in a state of panic, an individual will naturally seek relief, as it is too mentally and physically thirsted after truth.
Oh man, I haven't done a video for a while, and I was just about to make fun of myself for taking forever to explain that point, and then I also restarted the video. Oh, we haven't seen that, that's for sure.
It is too mentally and physically draining to subsist in this hyper-emotional state. While escaping from the state of panic can be accomplished through adaptive means, such as facing up to and defeating the fear-generating threat, another way to escape is to undergo a psychotic break. A psychotic break is not a descent into a state of greater disorder, as many believe, but a reordering of one's experiential world, which blends fact and fiction, or delusions and reality, in a way that helps end the feelings of panic. Silvano Arietti, one of the 20th century's foremost authorities on schizophrenia, explains the psychogenic steps that lead to madness. Firstly, there is the phase of panic, when the patient starts to perceive things in a different way, is frightened on account of it, appears confused, and does not know how to explain.
Okay, so this is actually an incredibly deep idea, right? Like, can we think of mental health, and we obviously do, we talk about things like this all the time, we talk about mental health all the time, but actually thinking of it as a aspect of the collective unconscious, right? That it can actually, what the collective unconscious would actually mean if we actually took the idea super seriously would be that we affect each other, and we can affect each other in these ways towards, happiness and meaning and purpose, or towards, delusion and reorder, as they're saying. So yeah, it's interesting. Let's keep going here.
The strange things that are happening. The next step is what Arrietty calls
Cheers.
a phase of psychotic insight, whereby an individual succeeds in putting things together by devising a pathological way of seeing reality, which allows him to explain his abnormal experience.
Yeah, right. So they're comparing it to the witch trial, right? So they're like initially the phase of panic, where they start to have this. Well, at this time, there were obviously women who they thought were experimenting with witchcraft, or they thought they were like literally witches, right? And so there's this phase of panic about that, which gave them the psychotic insight that we need to round them up and have the Salem witch trials. So it's such a disturbing story of like something that happened in a very specific place, like
The phenomenon is called insight because the patient finally sees meaning and relations in his experiences. But the insight is psychotic because it is based on delusions, not on adaptive and life-promoting ways of relating to whatever threats precipitated the panic. The delusions, in other words, allow the panic-stricken individual to escape from the flood of negative emotions, but at the cost of losing touch with reality, and for this reason, Arrietty says that a psychotic break can be viewed as an abnormal way of dealing with an extreme state of anxiety. If a panic-triggering flood of negative emotions in a weak and vulnerable individual can trigger a psychotic break, then a mass psychosis can result when a population of weak and vulnerable individuals is driven into a state of panic by threats real, imagined, or fabricated. But as delusions can take many forms, and as madness can manifest in countless ways, the specific manner in which a mass psychosis unfolds will differ based on the historical and cultural context of the infected society. But in the modern era, it is the mass psychosis of totalitarianism that appears to be the greatest threat. Totalitarianism, writes Arthur Versluis,
I was wondering
is
if
the
they're going to
modern
go there.
phenomenon of total centralized state power, coupled with the obliteration of individual human rights. In the totalized state, there are those in power, and there are the objectified masses, the victims. In a totalitarian society, the population is divided into two groups, the rulers and the ruled, and both groups undergo a pathological transformation. The rulers are elevated to an almost
Like, honestly, look at that artwork. That's so intense.
godlike status, which is diametrically opposed to our nature as imperfect beings who are easily corrupted by power. The masses, on the other hand, are transformed into the dependent subjects of these pathological rulers and take on a psychologically regressed and childlike status. Hannah Arendt, one of the 20th century's preeminent scholars of this form of rule, called totalitarianism an attempted transformation of human nature itself. But this attempted transformation only turns sound minds into sick minds. For as the Dutch medical doctor who studied the mental effects of living under totalitarianism wrote, "There is in fact much that is comparable between the strange reactions of the citizens of totalitarianism and their culture as a whole, on the one hand, and the reactions of the sick schizophrenic on the other. The social transformation that unfolds under totalitarianism is built upon and sustained by delusions. For only deluded men and women regress to the childlike status of obedient and submissive subjects, and hand over complete control of their lives to politicians and bureaucrats. Only a deluded ruling class will believe that they possess the knowledge, wisdom, and acumen to completely control society in a top-down manner, And only when under the spell of delusions would anyone believe that a society composed of power-hungry rulers on the one hand,
Whoa, what's
and a
that?
psychologically regressed population on the other, will lead to anything other than mass suffering and social ruin. But what triggers the psychosis of totalitarianism? As was explored in the previous video of this series, the mass psychosis of totalitarianism begins in a society's ruling class.
That is such a trippy picture. The triple puppet
The
thing.
mass psychosis of totalitarianism begins in a society's ruling class. The individuals that make up this class,
Stalin
be it
and Mao.
politicians, bureaucrats, or crony capitalists, are very prone to delusions that augment their power, and
North
no
Korea.
delusion is more attractive to the power-hungry than the delusion that they can and should control and dominate a society. When a ruling elite becomes possessed by a political ideology of this sort, be it communism, fascism, or technocracy, the next step is to induce a population into accepting their rule by infecting them with the mass psychosis of totalitarianism. This psychosis has been induced many times throughout history, and as Mirlu explains, it is simply a question of reorganizing and manipulating collective feelings in the proper way. The general method by which the members of a ruling elite can accomplish this end is called menticide, with the etymology of this word being a killing of the mind, and as Mirlu further explains, menticide is an old crime against the human mind and spirit, but systematized anew. It is an organized system of psychological intervention and judicial perversion through which a ruling class can imprint their own opportunistic thoughts upon the minds of those they plan to use and destroy. Priming a population for the crime of menticide begins with the sowing of fear. When an individual is flooded with negative
Menticide.
emotions, such as fear or anxiety, he or she is very susceptible to a descent into the delusions of madness.
Oh, I guess menticide obviously would be like a combination of the term mental and homicide. Menticide, I've never heard that before though.
Threats, real, imagined, or
This
fabricated,
is
can be
intense.
used to sow fear, but a particularly effective technique is to use waves of terror.
Waves.
Under this technique, the sowing of fear is staggered with periods of calm. But each of these periods of calm is followed by the manufacturing of an even more intense spell of fear. And on the process goes. Or as Mirlu writes, each wave of terrorizing creates its effects more easily after a breathing spell than the one that preceded it, because people are still disturbed by their previous experience.
Exactly.
Morality becomes lower and lower, and the psychological effects of each new propaganda campaign become stronger. It reaches a public already.
This chart is so important to understand. I've never heard that idea articulated like this before, but that's completely right.
Softened
I
up.
think.
While fear primes a population for menticide, the use of propaganda to spread misinformation and to promote confusion with respect to the source of the threats and the nature of the crisis helps to break down the minds of the masses. Government officials and their lackeys in the media can use contradictory reports, nonsensical information, and even blatant lies. As the more they confuse, the less capable will a population be to cope with the crisis and diminish their fear in a rational and adaptive manner. Confusion, in other words, heightens the susceptibility of a descent into the delusions of totalitarianism. Or as Mirlu explains, logic can be met with logic, while illogic cannot.
Yeah.
It confuses those who think straight. The big lie and monotonously repeated nonsense have more emotional appeal than logic and reason. While the people are still searching for a reasonable counter-argument to the first lie, the totalitarians can assault them with another. Never before in history have such effective means existed to manipulate a society into the psychosis of totalitarianism. Smartphones and social media, television and the internet, all in conjunction with algorithms that quickly censor the flow of unwanted information, allow those in power to easily assault the minds of the masses. What is more, the addictive nature of these technologies means that many people voluntarily subject themselves to the ruling elite's propaganda with a remarkable frequency.
Look at that.
Modern technology, explains Mirlu, teaches man to take for granted the world he is looking at. He takes no time to retreat and reflect. Technology lures him on, dropping him into its wheels and movements. No rest, no meditation, no reflection, no conversation. The senses are continually overloaded with stimuli. Man doesn't learn to question his world anymore. The screen offers him answers, ready-made. But there is a further step the would-be totalitarian rulers can take to increase the chance of a totalitarian psychosis, and this is to isolate the victims and to disrupt normal social interactions. When alone and lacking normal interactions with friends, family, and coworkers, an individual becomes far more susceptible to delusions for several reasons. Firstly, they lose contact with the corrective force of the positive
No, that's
example.
certainly true.
For not everyone is tricked by the
Look at
machinations of the
that.
ruling
That's
elite,
awesome.
and the individuals who see through the propaganda
guy
can
not
help
doing
free
it.
others from the menticidal assault. If, however, isolation is enforced, the power of these positive examples greatly diminishes. But another reason that isolation increases
If isolation, think about what he just said. If isolation is enforced, the power of the positive in like role model basically is diminished.
the efficacy of menticide is because, like many other species, human beings are more easily conditioned into new patterns of thought and behavior when isolated. Or as
Yeah.
Mirlu explains with regards to the physiologist
Oh my
Ivan
God.
Pavlov's work on behavioral conditioning, Pavlov made another significant discovery. The conditioned reflex could be developed most easily in a quiet laboratory with a minimum of disturbing stimuli. Every trainer of animals knows this from his own experience. Isolation and the patient repetition of stimuli are required to tame wild animals. The totalitarians have followed this rule.
Wow.
They know that they can condition their political victims most quickly if they are kept in isolation. Alone, confused, and battered by waves of terror, a population under an attack of menticide descends into a hopeless and vulnerable state. The never-ending stream of propaganda turns minds once capable of rational thought into playhouses of irrational forces. And with chaos swirling around them and within them, the masses crave a return to a more ordered world. The would-be totalitarians can now take the decisive step. They can offer a way out and a return to order in a world that seems to be moving rapidly in the opposite direction. But all this comes at a price. The masses must give up their freedom and cede control of all aspects of life to the ruling elite. They must relinquish their capacity to be self-reliant individuals who are responsible for their own lives, and become submissive and obedient subjects. The masses, in other words, must descend into the delusions of the totalitarian psychosis. The totalitarian systems of the 20th century represent a kind of collective psychosis. Whether gradually or suddenly, reason and common human decency are no longer possible in such a system.
Yeah, you know, the more I think about this, my point about how it relates to the collective unconscious, I don't know. I would kind of question my earlier point even, because I guess his point that it's actually the collective conscience, not unconscious. That it's well, the effect. Okay, so that the effect is happening at the unconscious level, but being expressed at the conscious level. That's what I'm trying to say.
There is only a pervasive
Personally and
atmosphere of
collectively.
terror and a projection of the enemy, imagined to be in our midst. Thus society turns on itself, urged on by the ruling authorities. But the order of a totalitarian world is a pathological order. By enforcing a strict conformity and requiring a blind obedience from the citizenry, totalitarianism rids the world of the spontaneity that produces many of life's.
So I know you probably know, but just in case anyone doesn't know, totalitarianism in its most basic sense, just think it, the word total, right? Like total control, the government's total control over everything, a totalitarian situation right within. That's so, anyways, that's just why he keeps using that word.
Joys and the creativity that drives society forward. The total control of this form of rule, no matter under what name it is branded, be it rule by scientists and doctors, politicians and bureaucrats, or a dictator, breeds stagnation, destruction, and death on a mass scale. And so perhaps the most important question facing the world is how can totalitarianism be prevented? And if a society has been induced into the early stages of this mass psychosis, can the effects be reversed? While one can never be sure of the prognosis of a collective madness, there are steps that can be taken to help effectuate a cure. This task, however, necessitates many different approaches from many different people. For just as the menticidal attack is multi-pronged, so too must be the counterattack. According to Carl Jung, for those of us who wish to help return sanity to an insane world, the first step is to bring order to our own minds and to live in a way that provides inspiration for others to follow. It is not for nothing that our age cries out for the Redeemer personality, for the one who can emancipate himself from the grip of the collective psychosis and save at least his own soul, who lights a beacon of hope for others, proclaiming that here is at least one man who has succeeded in extricating himself from the fatal identity with the group psyche. But assuming one is living in a manner free of the grip of the psychosis,
it is not for... Sorry, I gotta do that again. That was an incredible... It is not for nothing that our age cries out for the Redeemer personality, for the one who can emancipate himself from the grip of the collective psychosis and save at least his own soul, who lights a beacon of hope for others, proclaiming that here at least is one man who has succeeded in extricating himself from the fatal identity with the group psyche. Carl Jung. Not one to shy away from the epic quote, that's for sure.
There are further steps that can be taken. Information that counters the propaganda should be spread as far and as wide as possible. For the truth is more powerful than the fiction and falsities peddled by the would-be totalitarian rulers.
Yep.
And so their success is in part contingent on their ability to censor the free flow of information. Another tactic is to use humor and ridicule to delegitimize the ruling elite, or as Mirlu explains, we must learn to treat the demagogue and aspirant dictators in our midst with the weapon of ridicule.
That's like the South Park effect.
The demagogue himself is almost incapable of humor of any sort.
Yeah.
And if we treat him with humor, he will begin to collapse. A tactic recommended by Václav Havel, a political dissident under Soviet communist rule, who later became president of Czechoslovakia, is the construction of what are called parallel structures. A parallel structure is any form of organization, business, institution, technology, or creative pursuit that exists physically within a totalitarian society, yet morally outside of it. In communist Czechoslovakia,
physically within it, but morally outside of it. What an idea that is. At some point I should do another video about what happened in Czechoslovakia, because the fact that somebody in that scenario came up with this idea, right? Like, what happens when you're in this scenario? Like, he was in this, I'm assuming, I don't know his story, but I'm assuming he's in this like communist country where you're not allowed to do certain things. So how do you kind of exist within that system, but not within that? How do you, that system physically, but not morally? Parallel structures.
Havel noted that these parallel structures were more effective at combating totalitarianism than political action. Furthermore, when enough parallel structures are created, a second culture, or parallel society, spontaneously forms and functions as an enclave of freedom and sanity within a totalitarian world. Or as Havel explains in his book, The Power of the Powerless, What else are parallel structures than an area where a different life can be lived? A life that is in harmony with its own aims, and which in turn structures itself in harmony with those aims. What else are those initial attempts at social self-organization than the efforts of a certain part of society to rid itself of the self-sustaining aspects of totalitarianism, and thus to extricate itself radically from its involvement in the totalitarian system? But above all else, what is required to prevent a full descent into the madness of totalitarianism is action by as many people as possible. For just as the ruling elite do not sit around passively, but instead take deliberate steps to increase their power, so too an active and concerted effort must be made to move the world back in the direction of freedom. This can be an immense challenge in a world falling prey to the delusions of totalitarianism, but as Thomas Paine noted, tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph.
What a quote to end with. I bet that... Look, they say this video took a ton of work. I bet it did. I bet it did. That was like half an hour. Well, I probably talked for maybe, I don't know, a few minutes, 10 minutes. That was probably, what, 20 minutes? Their video. What a piece of thought-provoking art and video. Art combined with like a video essay. Incredible. All right, have a good night. I hope that made you think. It's an interesting idea. Wow. Yeah, that was a video. That was a video and a half. Hope you have a good day. Cheers.